The ladder cracked clean through the second rung on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882, and Letitia Hawthorne decided then and there that she was not going to let a broken piece of pine would be the thing that finally defeated her. She had survived 2 brutal Kansas winters alone. She had survived a drought that turned her vegetable garden to cracked, pale earth. She had survived the death of her husband, Robert Hawthorne, who had gone out one bitter February morning 18 months ago to check on a sick calf, and never come back, his heart giving out somewhere between the barn and the back pasture, his body found frozen stiff at the edge of the fence line by her nearest neighbor, a half-blind old man named Clyde Watkins who lived 3 miles east and smelled perpetually of pipe tobacco. She had survived all of that. She was not going to let a roof leak ruin the inside of the only home she had left. So Letitia Hawthorne dragged the broken ladder from the barn, propped it against the south-facing wall of the small clapboard house, and began climbing with all the determination of a woman who had learned, through considerable pain, that if something needed doing, she was the only one who was going to do it. The ladder wobbled horribly. The cracked second rung flexed under her boot each time she stepped on it, threatening to splinter through entirely, and there was a sideways lean to the whole structure that made her stomach tilt. She had a bundle of cedar shingles tucked under one arm and a leather pouch of nails looped over her shoulder, and she climbed with both hands gripping the sides so hard that her knuckles had gone the color of bleached linen. She made it to the roof. That was what mattered. The damage was not enormous, but it was not small either. 3 shingles on the south slope had lifted and cracked during a windstorm the previous week, and every time the clouds gathered and the rain came down in gray sheets across the Kansas flatlands, water seeped through the gap and dripped steadily onto the wooden floor of the small bedroom where her 7-year-old daughter, Clara, slept. Letitia had been placing a tin pot beneath the drip, emptying it each morning, and the sound of water striking metal in the quiet dark of the night had begun to work on her nerves in a way that felt almost personal, like an accusation. The sky that morning was pale and wide and cloudless, the kind of Kansas October sky that stretched so far and thin in every direction that it made a person feel small in a way that was either humbling or terrifying, depending on how well things were going. A dry wind moved across the prairie from the northwest. The grass beyond the fence line had gone tawny and gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek bed a quarter-mile off had dropped most of their leaves, which lay in drifts along the fence posts like faded letters nobody had gotten around to reading. Letitia pulled the first damaged shingle free and tossed it aside. She positioned the new one carefully, pressed her nail into the wood, and reached for the hammer she had tucked into the loop of her apron. The hammer head caught the sunlight as she swung it, and the sound of it rang out clean and sharp across the empty morning. She did not hear the horse until it had already stopped. There was no gradual approach of hooves, no warning sound building from a distance. One moment the morning was empty and still, and the next moment she looked up from her work and there was a man on horseback at the edge of her yard, sitting very quiet and very still in the saddle, watching her. He was not a man she recognized immediately, though she would later come to understand that she had seen him before from a distance, the way you sometimes see a thing and file it somewhere in the back of your mind without ever quite looking directly at it. He rode a dark bay horse with a black mane and a white star on its forehead, the kind of horse that spoke of serious money without being showy about it. The man himself was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual labor rather than vanity, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead beneath a weathered hat the color of old tobacco. His jaw carried several days of beard, and his coat was a deep brown canvas duster that had seen real use. He had steady eyes, the sort of gray-green that changed color depending on what the sky was doing above them. He looked at Letitia on the roof. He looked at the broken ladder propped against the wall below her. He looked at the bundle of shingles still under her arm and the hammer in her hand. He did not say a single word. He swung down from the horse, looped the reins around the fence post with the easy habit of a man who has done it 10,000 times without thinking about it, walked across the yard to the ladder, and began climbing up after her. Letitia stared. His boots appeared at the roof edge, and then the rest of him, and he moved onto the slope of the roof with the careful, practiced balance of someone who had worked on rooftops before. He crouched beside her, took the bundle of shingles from under her arm without asking, set them down on the flatter part of the ridge, and held out his hand for the hammer. Letitia Hawthorne had not been a woman for speechlessness in her life. She had been known in Caldwell, Kansas, as a woman of considerable opinion and directness, the kind of woman who spoke plainly and expected the same in return. Robert had loved that about her. He had told her so many times. But she found herself handing the hammer to a complete stranger on her own rooftop, without having formed a single word in her mouth. He went to work. He was competent and efficient and methodical, and he worked with the quiet, purposeful focus of a man who did not feel the need to fill silence with noise. He positioned the shingles correctly, set the nails, drove them with clean, strong strokes that did not waste a single motion. He checked the surrounding shingles for looseness, replaced one that she had not noticed was compromised, and ran his hand along the ridge cap to test the ceiling there. After perhaps 10 minutes, Letitia found her voice. "I do not know who you are," she said. He glanced at her sideways without pausing the work. His expression was not unkind. It was simply measuring, the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to understand before he speaks to it. "Louis Sheridan," he said. "I run the Broken Bow Ranch about 4 miles south of here." His voice was lower than she expected, not rough exactly, but worn in the way that good leather wears, with a kind of density to it. "Letitia Hawthorne," she said, because it seemed required. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he already knew. "I know who you are," he said. There was nothing threatening in the statement. It was simply a fact. The way distances and weather were facts in this part of Kansas, things you knew because knowing them was part of living in a place. She was the widow woman on the Hawthorne claim, the one whose husband had died in the cold. People knew these things about each other out here on the flatlands, where distance made neighbors sparse and information traveled slowly but thoroughly, the way water moves through deep rock. "The ladder is broken," she said, because she felt she ought to explain herself, and then felt irritated that she felt that way, because the ladder was broken and she had been managing it perfectly well and she did not owe explanations to anyone. "Yes," he said, "I saw. I was managing. I can see that." He drove in the last nail on the new shingle and sat back on his heels to look at his work. "It's faster with two." There was no condescension in it. He was not suggesting she couldn't do it. He was simply making an observation about mathematics. Letitia found that she could not argue with mathematics. "Are you in the habit of climbing onto strangers' roofs?" she asked. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "First time," he said. He stood carefully, tested the row of new shingles with a gentle pressure of his boot, and seemed satisfied. He looked across the roof's expanse once more, and then he looked out across her land with the same easy survey he gave the roofwork, the way a man does when land is the thing he understands best in the world. His gaze moved across the fenced pasture, the small garden plot gone dormant for the season, the barn that wanted paint, the two-strand wire fence along the east side that had a post leaning at an angle that would not survive the winter winds. He noticed all of it. She could see him notice it. "Your fence post on the east run," he said. "The third one in from the corner. It's going to go before Christmas." Letitia said nothing, because he was correct, and she knew it, and she did not yet know what to do with this man who rode up silent and helped her without asking, and then told her things about her own property that she already knew. He turned to look at her directly for the first time since they had been up on the roof together, and she had a moment to really see his face. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deep, the kind that came from squinting across open land for years. There was something in his expression that was harder to name, a quality of attention that felt different from mere curiosity. He looked at her the way he looked at the roof and the fence post, with serious, careful regard, as though she were something worth understanding correctly. "I'll go now," he said, "unless there's anything else needs doing." It was said plainly and without any expectation built into it. He was not angling for an invitation. He was simply making the offer the way a person offers a hand across a gap, because it is the decent thing to do and not because they expect anything particular to come of it. Letitia looked around her roof. There was nothing else that needed immediate attention, not today. "No," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Sheridan." Nodded, and they descended the broken ladder together in silence, which felt oddly natural, and at the bottom he straightened his hat, walked to his horse, unlooped the reins from the fence post, and swung back up into the saddle with the ease of a man who spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He looked down at her from the saddle. "That ladder needs replacing," he said. "I know," she said. "There's good lumber at Jennings' store in Caldwell." "I know that too." He looked at her for one more moment. There was something in that last look that was different from the rest of the morning, something less measured and more direct, something she could not entirely categorize, but that left a faint warmth in her chest long after he had turned the bay horse south and ridden away across the dry October grass, until he was a small dark shape against the endless flat horizon, and then nothing at all. Letitia stood in her yard for a long time after he disappeared. Then she picked up the broken ladder, carried it to the barn, and leaned it against the wall there. She would get new lumber. She would build a new ladder. She would do it herself, the way she did everything herself, and it would be fine. But she found herself thinking about the weight of the hammer being lifted from her hand with no ceremony and no commentary, and how entirely strange and entirely not unpleasant that had been. The next Thursday, she drove the wagon into Caldwell for supplies, and she bought the lumber for the ladder from Jennings' store, and she did not think it was at all significant that she had followed a suggestion from Louis Sheridan to do so, because she had already known she needed it and had simply not gotten around to it yet. Caldwell in October of 1882 was a town in transition. It had been one of the great cattle trail destinations at the end of the Kisham Trail, and the Longhorn drives that had made it briefly wild and loud and dangerous had slowed considerably as the Kansas legislature extended the quarantine line westward, pushing the cattle trade further from the settled farmlands. The drovers still came through sometimes, and the cowboys with their dust and their noise and their loose spending, but the town was settling into something more permanent now, with a schoolhouse and a newspaper and a church with a real bell in the tower, and merchants who expected to still be there in 10 years. Letitia tied the wagon in front of the general store and went inside, and while she was at the counter placing her order for flour and salt and lamp oil and the lengths of pine for the ladder, she heard her name spoken behind her and turned to find Eleanor Bates, whose husband ran the feed and grain operation on the east end of Main Street, standing with a basket over one arm and a look of carefully managed sympathy on her broad, pleasant face. "Letitia, I heard you had a visitor last week," Eleanor said, in the tone of a woman who had heard considerably more than just the fact of a visitor. "I had a man help me with the roof," Letitia said evenly. Eleanor's expression adjusted itself in the way expressions do when a person decides to be tactful despite themselves. "Louis Sheridan," she said. "He's a good man, quiet, keeps to himself mostly." "He was helpful," Letitia said. "He's been alone since Margaret passed," Eleanor said, which was clearly the actual information she had been building toward. "That was going on 3 years ago now. Fever, terrible thing." Letitia felt something move in her at this information, a recognition she did not particularly welcome, because it was too close to the way she recognized her own situation in other people's stories. She had not asked about his history. She was not asking now. "It was kind of him to stop," she said, and steered the conversation firmly toward the question of whether Jennings had received the new bolts of wool flannel his wife had mentioned. But she carried the information home with her in the wagon, nestled among the flour sacks and the lamp oil and the fresh-cut lumber, and it sat in the back of her mind with the quiet persistence of a thing that intended to stay there. His wife had died of fever 3 years ago. He was alone on the Broken Bow, 4 miles south of her claim. He had ridden up without invitation and helped her with her roof and had not made a production of it either direction, not turning it into charity, not turning it into a reason to linger, just doing the work and leaving. She thought about the way his hand had felt when it closed around the hammer she passed him. She had not intended to notice that. She noticed it anyway. The new ladder took her 2 evenings to build, with Clara helping hold the rung steady while Letitia drove the pegs. And Clara, who was 7 and very serious about things, declared it much better than the old one and asked if she could try climbing it. And Letitia said yes, and watched her daughter climb up and down twice with the solemn concentration of someone performing a scientific experiment. "Mama," Clara said from the 3rd rung, "who was the man on the roof?" Letitia had wondered when this question was coming. Clara had been in the small vegetable garden pulling the last of the dried bean pods when Louis Sheridan rode up, and she had watched the whole thing from behind the fence with the intent, unblinking attention small children direct at events they sense are important. "A neighbor," Letitia said. "Mr. Sheridan, he has a ranch south of us." Clara considered this. "He was tall," she said. "Yes, he was. He didn't say much." "No, he did not." "Papa didn't say much either," Clara said thoughtfully, "except when he was happy. When he was happy, he talked all the time." The observation landed in Letitia's chest with the soft, precise weight that her daughter's observations always carried, that particular combination of innocent accuracy and unwitting tenderness that made her throat close sometimes. She looked at Clara on the ladder, her brown braids coming half undone from their ties, her boots already muddy although it had not rained in 4 days, her face tilted up toward the roof with an expression of cheerful speculation. "Come down now," Letitia said gently. "It's nearly time for supper." She did not see Louis Sheridan for almost 3 weeks after that. She told herself she was not looking for him, and she mostly believed herself, except for the small, undeniable fact that when she went out in the morning to check on the horse and the 2 chickens she kept in the barn, she found herself glancing south across the flat land with a regularity she could not entirely justify. It was in the 2nd week of November, when the mornings had gone iron gray and cold, and the first real frost had come down hard overnight and killed the last of the grass, that she found him again. Or rather, found the evidence of him. She went out to the east fence to check on the leaning post she had been putting off repairing, because the cold had set in and the ground would soon be too hard to work, and found it already done. A new post had been sunk deep and straight, the old one lying in the grass nearby, the wire retightened and stapled neat along the whole run. She stood at the fence and looked at it for a long time. There was no note. There was no indication of who had done it beyond the quality of the work, which was careful and solid, and the fact that no one else in her life had the slightest reason to come onto her land and fix her fence without being asked. She felt a complicated warmth move through her that she was not entirely prepared for. That afternoon she rode south. The Broken Bow Ranch was not so different from her own claim in its basic components, but the scale of it made the difference clear. The main house was larger, a proper 2-story frame house with a wide porch running along the front, well maintained, the white paint still holding up decently though it needed attention in a few places. There were 3 outbuildings that she could see from the road, a large barn, a bunkhouse, and a smaller structure she could not identify at the distance. There was a proper corral with 6 horses in it, including the dark bay with the white star, and a paddock beyond with several dozen head of cattle visible against the brown grass. She had not announced herself, and she had not planned out what she was going to say, both of which were atypical for Letitia Hawthorne, who generally believed in preparation. She tied her horse at the fence and walked to the porch. Before she reached the steps, the front door opened and Louis Sheridan stepped out, as though he had heard her coming, which he very likely had, because men who lived alone on quiet ranches developed an attentiveness to the sounds of their land that was almost animal in its precision. He looked at her and waited. "You fixed my fence post," she said, It was going to go before Christmas, he said. I mentioned that. You did, she agreed. You did not mention that you were going to come and fix it yourself. He looked at her steadily. Would you have let me? The question was asked without any particular cleverness, as though it were simply a practical inquiry, and Letitia considered it honestly and concluded that the honest answer was probably not, or at least not without considerable argument first, and that he had likely understood this and acted accordingly. You should have asked, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. The agreement came without defense or justification, just a straightforward acknowledgement that she was correct, and Letitia found that she could not build any further argument on that foundation because he had removed it by agreeing with her. She stood in his yard in the cold November afternoon, the wind pulling at the hem of her coat, feeling slightly at a loss, which was not a feeling she enjoyed. I want to pay you for the post, she said. I don't want paying, he said. Then I will bring you something from the kitchen. I made a good apple butter last month. I still have several jars. He looked at her and that almost smile moved at the corner of his mouth again, the one she had noticed on the roof. All right, he said. I will bring it Friday, she said. All right, he said again. There was a pause that stretched between them with the particular quality of a silence that is not uncomfortable but is aware of itself. Would you like to come in? He asked. There's coffee. She hesitated. She should go back. Clara would be home from school in 2 hours and there were things to do before then. There were always things to do. Just a cup, she said. The interior of the Broken Bow's main house was what she might have expected from a man living alone but who had once lived with a woman who cared for things. It was clean, more clean than most bachelor establishments she had ever encountered, but there was a sparse quality to it, a stripped-back tidiness that was different from the kind of order a woman created, which filled spaces rather than emptied them. There were no curtains on the kitchen windows. The table was bare wood, scrubbed white. There were shelves with their practical contents, tins of coffee and flour and salt and beans, and nothing decorative at all. It felt like a man who had taken down the things that reminded him and had not put anything back up in their place. She sat at the table while he made coffee, and she looked around without being obvious about it, and she thought about Eleanor Bates telling her that his wife had died of fever 3 years ago. She thought about what 3 years of this kind of quiet must feel like. He set the coffee down in front of her and sat across the table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the wind moved against the bare kitchen window and the coffee steamed between them. Your daughter, he said. She was watching from the garden that morning. Yes, Letitia said. She watches everything. She is very thorough about it. How old? 7. She'll be 8 in January. He nodded. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, not drinking it yet, just turning it. Does she have someone to look after her while you work? She goes to school in Caldwell on weekdays. Old Mrs. Peterson watches her in the afternoons if I'm late back. She paused. She's quite self-sufficient for 7. Robert always said she got that from me. The name came out naturally because Robert was part of the texture of her life and always would be, and she watched Louis Sheridan's face when she said it. There was no flinching, no awkwardness. He simply nodded. Wife was Margaret, he said, without being asked, offering it the way she had offered Robert's name as a fact of the landscape. I heard, Letitia said. I'm sorry. 3 years, he said. You keep expecting the house to stop feeling wrong, and it doesn't exactly do that, but it changes what wrong feels like. It was the most she had heard him say at once, and she felt the accuracy of it in her own bones because she understood completely what he meant. The wrongness did not go away. It modified. It shifted from acute to chronic, from a wound to a scar, and scars were permanent features of the body. They did not cease to exist. You simply learned to live around them. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. They drank their coffee in a silence that was entirely different from the silence on the roof, and when she left 40 minutes later and rode back north across the flat land with the cold wind pressing at her back, she felt something had shifted between the morning of the broken ladder and now, some small but irreversible movement, like a key turning in a lock that had been frozen shut for a long time. Friday came and she brought the apple butter, 2 jars of it, and he met her at the fence rather than waiting on the porch, which meant he had been watching for her, and the knowledge of that sat pleasantly inside her chest all the way home. The societal reality of Caldwell, Kansas in 1882 was not particularly generous to widows who showed any signs of interest in men beyond their prescribed period of mourning. Letitia was aware of this. She was aware of the way Alina Bates and the other women at church watched her with the particular attention of people who were deciding whether to approve or disapprove of something they had not yet seen clearly enough to judge. She was aware that she was expected to grieve visibly and persistently, and to frame any interaction with a male neighbor in terms of pure practicality for a considerable period beyond her current point. She found that she cared about this awareness the way she cared about the weather. It was real, it was a factor, and she took it into account. But she was not going to let it govern her completely, because she had learned in the 18 months since Robert's death that life did not pause itself out of respect for social convention, and that the roof leaked whether or not the widow was observing a proper mourning period. The visits continued, but slowly, with the unhurried pace of people who are both too self-aware and too privately cautious to rush. She brought preserves. He replaced a length of wire on the north fence that she had not asked him about but that had been on her mind. She invited him to Sunday dinner once, in the 3rd week of November, because Clara had apparently told him at some point during a brief exchange near the school in Caldwell that her mother made the best corn bread in the county, and Letitia had heard about this from Mrs. Peterson, who had overheard it, and had decided that if her daughter was going to make promises on her behalf, she was going to honor them with some dignity. He came on Sunday and ate dinner at the small kitchen table, and Clara regarded him across her plate with the focused, unblinking seriousness she directed at everything important, asking him questions about the horses on the Broken Bow and what their names were, and which one was fastest, and whether a horse knew when it was loved. And Louis Sheridan answered each question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything, as though a 7-year-old's questions deserved full consideration and honest answers. Letitia watched him with Clara and felt something she had not felt in almost 2 years, a gentle expansion in her chest, a loosening of something she had been holding very tightly for a long time. After dinner, he stayed to help clear the table, because he had apparently decided that helping with a thing was simply what you did when you were in a place where a thing needed doing. And Clara had shown him the drawings she kept in a tin box under her bed, careful pencil drawings of horses and birds, and the view of the horizon from the back step, and he had looked at each one with genuine attention and told her she had a good eye. And Clara had looked as though she might float gently off the floor from the pride of it. When he left that evening, walking out through the early dark to where he had tied the bay horse, Letitia went with him to the fence and they stood for a moment in the cold outside the puddle of light from the house, and he said very quietly, "She's a fine girl." "She is," Letitia said. "She's the best of him, the best of Robert. He must have been a good man." "He was a good man," Letitia said. And then, because it was honest and this man seemed to deserve honesty, she added, "He was not perfect. He was stubborn and sometimes careless with money, and he was a terrible singer, but he thought he wasn't. But he was good at the core of him, good and steady." Louis Sheridan was quiet for a moment. "That's what matters," he said finally, "the core of it." She looked at him in the dark and thought about his core, about the man who climbed a roof without saying a word and fixed fence posts without being asked, and answered a child's questions about horses as if they were important questions, which perhaps they were. "Come for Christmas dinner," she said, "if you have nowhere else to be." He turned his head to look at her. In the dark she could see the outline of him but not the expression, and she was glad and sorry for that in equal measure. "I'll be here," he said. December came in cold and serious across the Kansas plains, the sky closing down to a low white ceiling that pressed on the land without quite releasing snow, the kind of dry cold that cracked wood and split lips and made the horses restless in the early mornings. Letitia cut and split her own firewood, which she had been doing since Robert died, and kept the stove burning steady and the house warm. And Clara came home from school each day with cold, bright cheeks and more opinions about everything than any child should reasonably have at 7 years old. And it was good. It was genuinely good, and Letitia was grateful for it in the bone-deep way that people who have been through difficulty are grateful for ordinary goodness. Louis came by twice in December before Christmas, once to bring a load of split firewood that he had cut from the fallen cottonwoods along the creek, stacking it himself against the side of the house without being asked, and once to check on the horses, because Letitia's mare had developed a slight unevenness in her gait that she had mentioned in passing during one of their conversations, and he had apparently not let go of. He looked at the mare's right front hoof and found a stone lodged deep in the soft tissue of the frog, which he removed carefully and cleanly, and the mare stood for it with an air of exasperated relief, and Letitia stood at the stall door watching him work and felt the tenderness of it move through her like a slow current. "You're good with animals," she said. "They're honest," he said, without looking up. "They tell you what's wrong if you know how to look." She thought about asking whether he found people as difficult to read as she suspected he might, but she held the question, because the answer seemed evident, and there was something about asking it directly that felt too close to a conversation she was not quite ready to have. Christmas Day arrived with a thin skiff of snow overnight, just enough to put a white skin on the ground that glittered in the pale morning light, and Clara was up before dawn, and had apparently been communicating her expectations about this day to the universe at some length, because she had her hair already braided when Letitia came down, which was unprecedented, and she was wearing her good dress, which was even more so. "He's coming," Clara said, with the certainty of a child who has decided something. "For dinner," Letitia said. "In the afternoon, not for breakfast." "I know," Clara said, "but the table needs to be ready." The table was ready by 8 in the morning, which was 4 hours ahead of time, set with the good tablecloth that had been a wedding gift from Letitia's mother in Georgia, and the plates that had blue flowers painted on them, which were kept usually in the high cabinet for special occasions, and Clara had put a small bunch of dried prairie grass and a few holly branches from the scrubby little shrub near the creek in a crockery jar in the center of the table, and it was genuinely lovely. Louis Sheridan arrived at 12:30 on the bay horse, and he had brought things. He stood at the door with an awkwardness that Letitia had never seen in him before, because he was not a man who was comfortable arriving with things in his arms, and he had clearly been persuaded by some internal argument to bring them anyway, and she loved him a little for the awkwardness of it, even though she had not yet formed the word love in relation to him in her own mind. He had a smoked venison haunch wrapped in cloth, because the broken bow had made a good deer hunt the previous week, and a tin of hard candies for Clara, and a small jar of honey from the hives that apparently belonged to one of his ranch hands. Clara received the candy tin with a dignity that lasted approximately 4 seconds before she broke into the wide, unguarded grin that made her look exactly like Robert at certain angles, and she said thank you with great seriousness, and then immediately asked if she could have one now, and Louis told her that was between her and her mother. Letitia said one, before dinner. The afternoon was long and warm and unhurried, with the smell of the venison roasting and the cornbread baking, and the apple preserves warming on the back of the stove, and outside the windows the snow-dusted prairie lay pale and silent and beautiful in the December light. Clara showed Louis the new drawings she had done since November, including a very creditable portrait of the bay horse that she had apparently been working on in secret, and his expression when he looked at it was the most open she had ever seen his face, something genuinely moved in it, something that had less to do with the drawing and more to do with the fact of being remembered by a child in this particular way. "May I keep this?" he asked. Clara considered for a moment with great seriousness. "Yes," she said, "but you have to put it somewhere you can see it." "I will put it on the mantelpiece," he said. "Good," Clara said, satisfied. After dinner, after Clara had been put to bed, warm and thoroughly contented with the day, Louis and Letitia sat at the cleared table with coffee, and the house was quiet around them and the fire was low and orange, and it was the kind of evening that does not have to be anything in particular to be everything. "I don't remember when I last had a day like this," he said. She looked at him across the table. "Like what?" "Easy," he said. "Just easy." She understood that. She understood it in the marrow of her bones, because the past 18 months had been anything but easy, not in the grinding mechanical sense of just getting through it, which was its own constant labor, but easy in the way of an ordinary thing that is good, that doesn't require bracing for. "Me either," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she let him look because she was looking back, and they were both adults who had been through genuine loss and who understood exactly what it meant to take stock of a person with seriousness, and she was not going to pretend she did not know what was happening between them because she did. "Letitia," he said. "Yes," she said. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words the way a careful man chooses footing on uncertain ground, testing each place before he committed his weight. "I'm not a man who says things easily," he said. "I've noticed," she said very gently. "But I want to say this correctly," he said, "because I don't want you to misunderstand it." "Go ahead," she said. "I haven't wanted to come anywhere the way I've wanted to come here," he said. "Not in a long time. And I know that's nothing you asked for and nothing you necessarily want, and I'm not asking you for anything back right now. I just thought you deserved to know it, because you're the kind of woman who deserves to know what's true." Letitia sat very still in her chair and let the words settle into her, like water going into dry ground, slow and deep. "I don't misunderstand it," she said quietly. "I don't misunderstand it at all." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the fire shifted and settled in the grate, and outside the snow-skimmed prairie lay cold and still under the January sky, and between the two of them there was something that had moved from possibility to something considerably more real, though neither of them were going to rush at it. "I am glad you rode up that morning," she said. Something in his face changed entirely at that, opened up in a way that made her understand, in a single unguarded moment, how much he had been holding himself in check, and how long he had been doing it. January went hard, the way Kansas Januaries did, with days of wind that came screaming down from the north and dropped temperatures to the kind of cold that made the air ache. And Letitia kept the stove going, and the animals fed, and Clara bundled into everything she owned for the walk to school on the mornings it was possible. And she did not see Louis for 2 weeks due to a severe cold snap that made travel across the open prairie a genuine risk. She found she missed him with a specificity that was new, not the diffuse ache of loneliness she had been carrying since Robert died, which was wide and general and attached to everything at once, but something pointed and particular, a shape in her days that had his dimensions. He came as soon as the cold broke, riding up on the bay in the first clear afternoon of February, and she saw him from the kitchen window and went to the door, and he rode up and she said, "You look thin." He looked at her for one beat. "You look well," he said. "Come in," she said. "I'll feed you." He stayed for 3 hours, and at the end of them, when he was standing at the fence with his hat in his hand in a gesture she had never seen him make before, that particular hat-in-hand posture that, in a man like Louis Sheridan, meant something considerable was happening underneath the still surface, he said, "I'd like to court you properly, if that's acceptable to you." Letitia looked at him. She looked at the hat in his hands and the serious set of his mouth and the steady gray-green eyes that had been watching her carefully since October. "It's acceptable," she said. He put his hat back on his head. "I'll call on you Saturday then," he said, "with your permission." "With my permission," she agreed. The courtship was conducted in the manner of the time and place, which meant Saturday afternoons and Sunday dinners when the weather permitted, and the occasional longer evening by the fire, and all of it proper and observed, which meant that half of Caldwell was aware of it within 2 weeks and had opinions. Eleanor Bates was cautiously approving. Her husband was more straightforwardly so, apparently being of the view that Louis Sheridan was a solid man who ran a good operation and treated people decently, which covered the essentials. Old Clyde Watkins, who had been the one to find Robert's body, and who had always felt a particular weight of responsible grief around the Hawthorne claim as a consequence, said gruffly, when he encountered Letitia in the Caldwell store, that Sheridan was a good man and he hoped she was not going to be stubborn about it. "I'm not being stubborn about it," Letitia told him. "I'm being careful." "There's a difference," Clyde allowed. "Just don't be so careful you talk yourself out of something good." She thought about that on the way home. She sat with it for several evenings, turning it over the way you turn a thing to look at it from all sides, because Clyde Watkins was not usually a man of wisdom, but occasionally landed on it by accident, and she thought this might be one of those times. Spring came, as it always did on the Kansas plains, with a quality of sudden relief, like a held breath released, the brown grass greening overnight, the cottonwoods along the creek going hazy with new leaves, the sky opening back up from its winter lid to the wide, particular blue that was impossible to describe to someone who had not seen Kansas in April, and that made even the most battered of hearts feel the possibility of things. Louis brought her wildflowers on the second Saturday of April, a loose bunch of them from the creek bottom, blue and yellow and white, held in his large hand with the slight awkwardness of a man who does not usually carry flowers and is not entirely sure of the protocol, but has committed to the gesture. And Letitia took them and put them in water on the kitchen table, and looked at them all day with a warmth in her chest that she was no longer pretending was anything other than what it was. She loved him. She had known it for some time, and she had been honest with herself about it for slightly less time, and she had not yet said it to him, because the saying of it was a thing that could not be unsaid, and that changed the terms of everything. And she was still careful, still protective of the part of herself that had already been broken once, and that she was not certain could survive being broken again. The question of whether it could or could not was settled for her on a warm May evening when they were sitting on her porch watching the last of the sunset go orange and pink across the western sky, and Clara, who had been inside allegedly preparing for bed, appeared in the doorway in her nightgown and regarded them both with the comprehensive assessment of a person who has been considering a matter at some length. "Are you going to marry my mama?" she asked Louis Sheridan. The directness of it would have alarmed Letitia in any context other than Clara, whom she had long since stopped trying to predict. She turned to look at Louis, partly in apology and partly because she was genuinely interested in his answer. Louis Sheridan looked at Clara with full seriousness. "That's something I'd need to discuss with your mama first," he said, "but I'd like to if she'd have me." Clara considered this answer for a moment. "She likes you," she said confidently. "She told Mrs. Peterson she liked you, and Mrs. Peterson told me." Letitia closed her eyes briefly. "Clara," she said, "bed." Clara went, with the serene satisfaction of a person who has accomplished something they set out to accomplish, and Letitia sat in the warm May evening with her hands folded in her lap and Louis Sheridan beside her, and the silence between them had an entirely new quality, charged and careful and full of things. "Is that true?" he asked. "That I like you," she said. "Yes. That is considerably understating it, but yes." He turned on the porch bench to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and the last light of the sunset was warm on both of them. "Letitia," he said. "You could kiss me," she said, "before you ask any formal question if you wanted to, because I'd rather know the answer to that first." There was a silence, and then that not-quite smile appeared and became the actual thing, a real, full smile, and it transformed his face in a way she had not yet seen, and that struck her somewhere she hadn't expected, and he leaned forward and kissed her quietly and warmly on the porch in the May evening while the sky went dark above them. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not fierce or hurried. It was thorough and genuine, and it tasted like coffee and certainty. And when she leaned back and looked at him, she knew the answer to the question she had asked herself since October, whether the part of her that had been broken once could manage again, and the answer was yes, it could, it already was, it had been mending itself toward this without her permission for months. "Louis," she said, "I'm going to ask you a formal question now," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not for the fence posts or the firewood. Not for Clara, though she's part of it, a good part. Because I have spent 6 months being more awake than I've been in 3 years. And because you are the most honest and strong and particular woman I have ever met. And because I want to go to sleep at night knowing you're there and wake up in the morning having that be true. She sat with that for a moment. The prairie smelled of spring grass and creek water, and the faint sweetness of the climbing roses that Robert had planted against the east wall of the house, which had come back again this year as they always did, as though they were determined to be here regardless of anything else. "Yes," she said, "I will." They were married in June, on a Saturday, at the small white church in Caldwell with the bell in the tower, and half the county seemed to have found reasons to be there. Eleanor Bates cried, which surprised no one. Old Clyde Watkins wore a coat that appeared to have been bought in approximately 1870 and never since put on, and he stood in the back with an expression of vinegary satisfaction that was the closest he came to sentiment. Clara was the flower girl and took the responsibility with enormous solemnity, scattering the petals with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the distance intervals. And she wore her good dress and her hair in the most elaborate braids Letitia had managed in her life. And she looked so beautiful and so serious that Letitia nearly cried before the ceremony even started. Louis Sheridan stood at the front of the church in a black coat she had not seen before, clearly purchased for the occasion, and he stood with his shoulders squared and his hat in his hands. And when she came up the aisle he looked at her the way he had looked at everything since the morning on the roof, with that careful, serious, direct attention, except that now there was nothing held back from it. It was completely unguarded, and she felt it on her like warm light the whole length of the aisle. The minister, Reverend Paul Morrow, asked if anyone had objection, and Clara, from her position at the end of the front pew, turned around and gave the assembled congregation a look of such clear warning that Letitia had to fix her eyes on Louis to keep from laughing. And Louis was definitely not looking at Clara for exactly the same reason. They said their vows in steady voices. Louis's voice was lower and quieter than the minister's, but it did not waver. They were married. The reception was held in the church hall and ran into the evening, with fiddle music and food that seemed to have materialized from every kitchen in Caldwell, and more dancing than Letitia had expected, because it turned out that Louis Sheridan could dance. And he did so with the same focused competence he brought to everything, moving with a deliberate and unhurried grace that was rather different from the self-conscious stomping of most of the men present. And Eleanor Bates watched them from across the room with an expression of thoroughly uncomplicated delight. Clara danced with Louis twice, standing on his boots while he moved, which he bore with patience and which she found extremely satisfactory, and she fell asleep at the table at 9 o'clock with her cheek on her folded arms, and Louis carried her to the wagon while Letitia gathered her coat and her flowers, and the three of them drove home under a June sky absolutely scattered with stars. The question of where they would live had been settled practically and without great drama. The Broken Bow was the larger operation, with the bigger house and the better capacity, and Letitia's claim was solid land but modest and would do better leased than farmed by herself. She had negotiated the lease agreement herself, because she was Letitia Hawthorne Sheridan and she negotiated her own agreements, and Louis had sat beside her while she did it and had not once suggested she needed him to do it for her. Moving was a different matter emotionally than it was practically. The house she was leaving was the house where she had come with Robert as a young bride of 22, where Clara had been born in the bedroom with the leaky roof, where she had grieved and survived and built herself back into something whole. She stood in each room the morning they moved and let herself feel it fully, because she had learned that the feelings that are not felt do not go away but simply go underground where they cause more trouble. Louis came and found her standing in Clara's room looking at the window, and he did not tell her it was fine or that she shouldn't feel sad or that the new house was better. He stood beside her and put his hand over hers on the windowsill, and that was all. She squeezed his hand and said, "All right. I'm ready." The broken bow became home with a speed that surprised her. It was partly the house itself, which was larger and more comfortable than the claim house, and partly the work of making it her own, because Letitia had opinions about curtains and arrangement, and where things ought to be, and she did not hesitate to express them. And Louis watched the house change around him with a quality of quiet pleasure that she thought was partly about the curtains and mostly about something else, about the return of life to a house that had been subsisting on its own for too long. Clara adapted with the philosophical pragmatism of children, who are often much more adaptable than adults when the circumstances feel good. She established herself in the larger of the two upstairs bedrooms, put her tin of drawings on the windowsill, and within a week had apparently adopted the entire broken bow operation as her personal responsibility, accompanying Louis on the morning rounds when she was not at school, asking questions about everything, and developing a particular bond with an older mare named Sunday who was retired from working and lived in the paddock in comfortable retirement. Louis's ranch hands, two full-time men named Garrett and old Felix, both took to Clara with the bemused fondness that men of the frontier often show toward children when they are not trying to pretend they don't, and Clara was perfectly aware of this and made full use of it. The first summer of their marriage had the quality of something genuinely new, which was different from the first summer with Robert, which had been new and frightening and beautiful all at once, and colored by the particular intensity of very young love. This was something different. It was warmer and more comfortable and more deeply rooted, because they were not beginning the way young people begin, in the bright confusion of first experience, but rather beginning the way people begin who have already learned what they are beginning costs and what it is worth, and that knowledge made it steadier and sweeter than anything purely new could be. She loved him. She loved the way he moved through his days with deliberate, unhurried competence. She loved his silences, which were not empty but full of attention. She loved the way he looked at her when she was not aware of it and then did not look away when she caught him, just met her eyes steadily with that level, direct gaze. She loved that he had put Clara's drawing of the bay horse on the mantelpiece the day after Christmas, and that it was still there, in a small frame he had apparently bought in Caldwell without mentioning it. He told her he loved her for the first time in July, in the kitchen, in the middle of completely ordinary circumstances, when she was attempting to do something complicated with a pastry crust, and he was sitting at the table reading one of the 3-month-old newspapers that constituted their connection to the wider world, and he looked up from the paper and said it, without preamble, as though he had simply decided it was the right moment. Which she came to understand was entirely characteristic of him. She put down her rolling pin and looked at him. "I love you too," she said. "I've loved you since February at least." He looked slightly taken aback, which was very satisfying. "February." "When you came back after the cold snap," she said. "I noticed you were thin and I was glad you were there and I thought that's that." He considered this for a moment with the air of a man recalculating something. "I should have said it sooner." "You said it now," she said, and picked up the rolling pin, and that was that. The summer was dry but not catastrophically so, and the cattle did well, and the leased claim land to the north produced a reasonable wheat crop, and Louis hired a third hand, a young man of 20 named Darnell Clay who came from somewhere in Missouri and who worked hard and kept to himself and was decent with the horses. The question of money, which was always present in a farming and ranching operation in Kansas in the 1880s, was not a comfortable question, but was a manageable one, which was all you could ask. There were injustices in that world that Letitia was not unaware of, being a woman of observation and conscience. The men who ran the stockyards in Caldwell set prices that squeezed the small ranchers, and the farmers with the comfortable certainty of people who controlled the only mechanism available, and there was little remedy for it. The homesteaders who had come to Kansas on the promise of land were often finding that promise was more complicated in its fulfillment than in its offering, and the dispossession of the people who had lived on this land before any of them was a fact of the landscape that sat with Letitia uneasily. The wide, open grasslands that had been claimed and fenced and turned over in a way that had not been asked for by the people who had known it first. She could not fix that. She could not fix the structural unfairness of the cattle market or the limitations placed on her own legal personhood as a woman in the territory. But she was aware of it, and she thought it mattered to be aware of it, and she raised Clara to be aware of it too. In September of that first year of their marriage, Louis came home from Caldwell with a look that she had learned to recognize, the carefully composed stillness of a man who has something to say and is working out how to say it correctly. She waited through dinner, watching him, and after Clara had gone upstairs, she sat down at the kitchen table across from him and looked at him directly. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "Garrett is leaving," he said. "Going to Colorado. His brother has a mine." "That's not all," she said. He turned his coffee cup. "Old Watkins's place might come up for sale," he said. "Clyde's sister wants him to come east. He's not well." She understood immediately. The Watkins claim was adjacent to hers, and her claim was adjacent to the Broken Bow. Together, the 3 parcels of land would constitute something considerably more significant than what they had now, a working ranch of genuine scale, the kind that could weather the bad years and capitalize on the good ones. "Can we afford it?" she asked. "Not easily," he said. "We'd need a bank loan. It would be tight for the first couple of years." "Would it work?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "If the cattle market holds and we don't have 2 dry summers running, and you're willing to be uncomfortable for a while." Letitia thought about the fence posts and the leaky roof and the 18 months of making everything work alone. She thought about what uncomfortable actually felt like from the inside. "Make the offer," she said. His expression shifted in that particular way she had learned to love, the quiet but unmistakable pleasure of a man who has married someone who understands him. "I already talked to the bank," he said. "Louis Sheridan," she said. "I wanted to know it was possible before I worried you with it," he said. "Next time worry me with it at the beginning," she said. "I want to know everything at the beginning." "Yes," he said. "All right." They bought the Watkins claim in November with the bank loan that made their first winter as landowners of any scale considerably more careful than comfortable, but Letitia was not afraid of careful. She ran the household on a strict economy, planted an ambitious kitchen garden in the spring, took in sewing work from women in Caldwell who wanted things she was skilled enough to do, and kept the accounts herself with a meticulous precision that Louis observed with what seemed to be genuine admiration. "You should have been running a bank," he told her once, looking over her account ledgers. "I should have had more options," she said, which was true, and both of them knew it. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "you should have," and there was nothing hollow in the acknowledgement. Winter softened to spring again, and the extended land of the combined Broken Bow, Hawthorne, and Watkins claims lay beneath the April sky in the particular gold green of new grass. And the cattle herd had grown to the point where they needed the space it provided. And Letitia stood on the porch of the main house one morning in April with her coffee, and looked out over all of it, and felt the solidness of it enter her like a tone struck clearly and held. Clara turned 8 in January of that year, and 9 the January after, and grew in the incremental way children do, by degrees that seemed small on any individual day and enormous across the months, taller and more competent and more opinionated in her views and increasingly skilled in her drawing, which had expanded from horses and birds to detailed and careful portraits of the people and animals around her, each one rendered with a patient precision that several people in Caldwell had commented on. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Croft, told Letitia that Clara had a remarkable gift for observation, which was true and which Letitia had known since Clara was 4, but it was gratifying to have it noted by someone with professional standing. In the second autumn of their marriage, Letitia discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Louis, not from reluctance, but from the need to fully inhabit the reality of it herself first, to turn it over and look at it from inside as well as outside. Because she was not a young woman having her first child in the confused wonder of newness, but a woman of 28 who understood what it cost and what it meant, and who wanted to be fully present to it. She told him in the evening, sitting on the porch in the September air that had turned cool and clear, and she watched his face as she told him, and what she saw in it was something she would carry for the rest of her life. It was not surprise, not alarm, not even just happiness, though it was certainly happiness. It was something rawer than that, a kind of undone quality, as though the news had reached some interior place in him that had been closed and locked for the 3 years before she came, and it had opened cleanly and fully and without hesitation. He put his arm around her on the porch bench, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the September evening without words for a long time, which was exactly right. Clara, informed the next morning at breakfast, received the news with the comprehensive consideration it deserved, spent approximately 45 seconds in visible thought, and then said, "I hope it's a boy because Mama says boys are different and it would be interesting." Louis looked at Letitia across the table. Letitia looked back at him. "Different," she said. "I did say that." "Good different or hard different?" Louis asked Clara seriously. Clara thought again. "Both," she said, with serene confidence, and turned her attention back to her oatmeal. The baby came in the spring, which felt right, in the way some timings feel inevitable rather than accidental. He arrived in April of 1884 during a long, hard night that tested every form of patience and courage Letitia possessed. With a leaner Bates serving as midwife and Louis pacing the kitchen below, with a thoroughness that reportedly wore a noticeable path in the floorboards, and Clara sitting at the top of the stairs with a blanket around her shoulders and a lamp, refusing to go to bed. He was born at 3 in the morning into the quiet dark of the Kansas spring, and he was whole and loud and real, and Letitia held him with the salt sting of tears. She didn't bother to stop and looked at his face, red and scrunched and furious with the newness of the world, and loved him with the fierce, immediate totality of it. Louis came in from the kitchen. He stood at the door for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight with the baby, and the expression on his face was something she had no word for that fully captured it, something enormous and close to undone, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and she watched him look, and she thought that this moment, this specific configuration of lamplight and man and new life and her own exhausted, entirely certain heart, was something she would carry for all of the years she had left. "He looks angry," Louis said. "He just got here," Letitia said. "He'll settle. What do we call him?" She looked at the baby's face and thought about names and what names carried and what they meant to give and to carry. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas James Sheridan." Louis said nothing for a moment, just looked at the baby with Thomas's small fist wrapped around his finger, and then he looked at her. "That's a good name," he said quietly. "I think so," she agreed. Clara appeared in the doorway at some point in the small hours of the morning, the blanket still around her shoulders, and regarded her brother with the careful assessment she gave everything important. "He's small," she said. "He'll grow," Letitia said. "He looks like Louis," Clara said. Louis glanced at her with something that was clearly surprise and pleasure at once, because Clara still sometimes called him Louis rather than anything else, because she had known him as Louis first, and she was a child who was precise about things, and the occasional times she said something that marked him as hers as well were things he received with an expression that made Letitia's chest ache with tenderness. "Come and sit with us," Letitia said. Clara came and sat on the other side of the bed from Louis, and the 4 of them were there in the lamplight together, and outside the Kansas spring moved across the new grass, and the cottonwoods along the creek were coming into leaf again, and the sky was beginning to lighten very slowly in the east toward the color that meant dawn coming. Thomas James Sheridan grew, as babies do, rapidly and decisively, filling the house with the particular noise and momentum of an infant becoming a person. He was an even-tempered baby, which Clara had predicted he would not be and was somewhat wrong about, though he had definite opinions that he expressed with considerable volume when crossed, and he had Louis's gray-green eyes and a head of dark hair that went curly at the back and made Louis look at him sometimes with an expression of baffled delight. Clara took her role as older sister with absolute seriousness, appointing herself an auxiliary supervisor and educator, and carrying out these duties with what could only be called dedicated enthusiasm. She taught Thomas to pat the horses when he was barely walking. She read to him every night she was home from school, seated beside him on the floor with a book propped between them and her voice patient and clear, and Thomas listened to her with the focused attention that he gave to everything Clara did, which appeared to be based on a correct assessment that Clara was the most interesting person in any given room. The broken bow continued to grow. The cattle operation expanded. The second year after they bought the Watkins claim, they paid down a third of the bank loan, and Letitia kept the accounts with the same unsparing accuracy she always had, and the numbers moved in the right direction slowly and steadily, which was better than the alternative. The late 1880s brought pressure to the Kansas cattle trade in the form of disease and drought, and the consolidation of the railroad's power over shipping rates, and there were ranchers who did not survive it, men who had overextended themselves in the good years and had nothing to absorb the bad ones. The broken bow survived, carefully and with difficulty in 2 particular years, because Letitia's accounting discipline had kept them from overextension, and because Louis was a man who could see hard times coming from a reasonable distance and prepared for them without panic. In the hard summer of 1887, when the range dried out and the cattle prices dropped and 2 of their neighbors gave up their claims and left the county, Louis rode in from the south pasture one August evening covered in dust and looking tired in a way that went deeper than just the day, and Letitia put dinner in front of him and sat across the table and said, "Tell me where we are." He laid out the numbers honestly. They were not ruined. They were not comfortable. They had 2 or 3 months of reasonable cushion if they trimmed further, and after that the situation became more uncertain. "What do we sell?" she said. "The north herd can go early," he said. "The price will be low, but the grass up there won't carry them through the winter anyway. Then we hold the rest." "The quarter horse," she said. It was a young stallion he had bought the previous year as an investment and had plans for that she knew he cared about. He looked at her. "He'll bring a good price," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't want to sell him." "I know that too," she said, "but we should." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "we should." They sold the stallion and the north herd early, and they tightened every way they could. And Clara, 14 by then and thoroughly aware of what was happening, did not say a word about her need for new boots until November, when the old ones genuinely could not be stretched another winter, and when Louis noticed and bought them himself on a Caldwell trip without being asked. She looked at them with an expression that was trying very hard not to be moved and failing, which undid both her parents in slightly different but equally complete ways. By the spring of 1888 the worst had passed, and the numbers were moving right again, and Letitia felt the release of it in her body the way she felt the loosening of a season, gradual and certain. They had been through something together that had its own particular depth, and she was aware of it. The way surviving difficulty together changes the quality of a thing, adds a layer of tested certainty to it. The way a bridge that has held weight becomes more trustworthy than one that hasn't been tried yet. She said this to Louis one evening, sitting on the porch with the late spring air warm around them and Thomas asleep inside and Clara in her room writing a very long and serious letter to a school friend who had moved to Wichita, and Louis listened with the complete attention he gave her when she was saying something real. "You know what I've thought about," he said when she had finished, "since I met you." "What?" she said. "You on that roof," he said, "with that broken ladder." She laughed genuinely, the unguarded full laugh that she had been aware for some time he could produce in her more easily than almost anything. That was not my most dignified moment. Yes, it was, he said. That was exactly your most dignified moment. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that level, fully open expression that still, after 6 years of marriage, could do something complicated and warm to the center of her chest. You are a strange man, she said. That's fair, he said. She leaned against him, and his arm came around her the way it always did, with the ease of long habit that was also still, somehow, every single time, a comfort that felt fresh. Thomas walked over and around and through their lives in the way of small boys, all motion and opinion and catastrophic enthusiasm, and grew toward 5 and 6 with the same gray-green eyes and the same quality of deliberate assessment that his father had, combined with an emotional expressiveness and a delight in language that was all Letitia. And by the time he was 6, he was following Louis around the ranch with the focused devotion of a person who has identified the North Star of their world and is keeping it in sight at all times. Louis with Thomas was one of the things she loved most about her life, the easiness of it, the way Louis had never had to learn how to be present to a child, because he simply was present in the way he was present to everything, with full attention and complete genuineness, and Thomas received this like soil receiving rain. Clara, at 15, was a young woman of real beauty and formidable intelligence, and an artistic talent that by now several people in Caldwell had called exceptional, and Letitia had begun quietly investigating what possibilities might exist for a young woman of exceptional artistic talent in a state that did not have enormous resources to direct at such things. She wrote a letter to the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia and received a reply about an art program that was developing there. And she kept the letter folded in the account book where she kept things that required thought before action, and she thought about it over many evenings. She talked to Clara about it in the autumn of her 15th year, sitting at the kitchen table with the drawing spread between them, and Clara listened with the careful seriousness she had always given important things, and then she said, "You want to send me somewhere better." "I want you to have every option," Letitia said. "That's not the same as sending you away." "It would mean leaving," Clara said. "In a few years," Letitia said. "Not yet, and coming back. The world doesn't end at Caldwell, Clara. It doesn't even start here." Clara looked at the drawings for a long moment. "Papa Robert used to say Kansas was the whole world," she said. Letitia felt the familiar movement of love and loss that she had learned to hold together, the way you hold two things that are both true in each hand simultaneously. "He did," she said. "He loved it here, but he would want every door open for you." "I know that," Clara nodded slowly. Then she looked up at Letitia with an expression that was all Clara, direct and measuring and entirely without pretense. "And Louis," she said. "He'll miss you terribly," Letitia said, "and be so proud of you that he won't know what to do with himself." Clara smiled, and it was the wide, unguarded smile that Letitia had been seeing since she was an infant, the one that still sometimes looked exactly like Robert, and it was wholly, perfectly Clara all at the same time. In the summer of 1890, when the prairie was high and golden and the sky was the deepest blue it got all year, Letitia found herself pregnant again, which was unexpected and wonderful in equal measure, and she told Louis in the kitchen, the same place she had told him about Thomas, and his response was as entire and open as it had been the first time, which she had not taken for granted and did not now. "A second," she said. "At 30. "At 30, he agreed, and there was nothing in his voice except gladness. "You'll have to tell Clara," she said. "She'll have thoughts." Clara had thoughts. They were organized and considered and ultimately thoroughly positive, though delivered with the characteristic gravity of a young woman who takes all significant matters seriously. Thomas, told at breakfast that he was going to have a brother or sister, considered this information for a full minute before saying, "I hope it's a girl, because I want to see what a girl version of us is like." Louis looked at Letitia. Letitia looked at Louis. "A girl version of us," she said. "Terrifying," he said. "Wonderful." The baby arrived in February of 1891, in a winter that was cold but clear, and she was a girl, which Thomas received as a personal triumph of planning. And she was born in the early afternoon with the winter light coming through the bedroom windows. And her name was Catherine Rose Sheridan. And she had Letitia's dark eyes and what appeared in the first hours to be an extraordinary quantity of opinions about the general state of the world, expressed at volume. "She's loud," Thomas said from the doorway. "So were you," Clara told him. "I was not. You absolutely were." Louis held Catherine with the same steady, completely engaged attention he had brought to holding Thomas, and he looked at his daughter's face with the same enormous, unguarded expression. And Letitia watched him hold her and thought, as she had thought 1,000 times in the years between the broken ladder and this afternoon, that she was grateful down to the bones of her that a cracked rung of pine had made her climb that roof on a Tuesday morning in October of 1882. The years of the early 1890s were good years on the Broken Bow. Not easy, because no years on the Kansas plains were truly easy, but solid and forward-moving, and full of the daily life that Letitia had come to understand was the actual substance of things. Not the dramatic moments, but the ordinary days that made up the majority of a life, and that constituted, if done well, a form of sustained joy that was quieter and more durable than anything that arrived in a single dramatic stroke. Clara left for the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia in the autumn of 1892, at 17, on a morning of clear golden September light, with a trunk full of her drawings and her careful, organized self, and the quiet determination of someone who has been building toward a thing for a long time. Louis lifted the trunk into the wagon without being told to. He stood at the wagon when it was loaded and looked at Clara with an expression that was several things at once, proud and sad and entirely sure of her. "You write," he said. "Every week," she promised. "Don't let them tell you your work isn't worth something," he said. "It is." Clara looked at him for a moment, this man who had come into her life at 7 years old without announcing himself, and had been there every day since in the way of something so fundamental it was easy to forget to notice it and impossible to imagine being without. "Thank you," she said, with all the earnestness of 17. "For everything, from the beginning." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and she hugged him with the sudden, fierce completeness of a person who has been composing themselves all morning and finally given it up, and he held on with both arms and looked at Letitia over Clara's shoulder with everything in his face. Letitia rode with Clara to the train in Caldwell, and they talked the whole way there about Emporia and what she might find, and what to do if she got homesick, and who to write to if she needed anything. And at the platform, while they waited for the train, Letitia held both of Clara's hands in hers and looked at her daughter's face. This face she had been looking at for 15 years. This particular combination of Robert's strong jaw and her own dark eyes, and something entirely and specifically Clara that had nothing to do with either of them and was entirely its own. "I am so proud of you," she said. Clara's composure, which had been holding since morning, slipped at that. "I'll be back for Christmas," she said, which was not technically an answer but was entirely Clara's way of saying she heard. The train came and Clara got on it, and Letitia stood on the platform and watched it go until it was a distant point of smoke above the horizon, and then she drove home across the October plain under the wide Kansas sky that could break your heart with its beauty if you let it. Louis was on the porch when she got home, sitting in the late afternoon light with Thomas beside him, the two of them working on something that appeared to involve a piece of tack and considerable focused attention. Thomas, at 7, had his father's hands already, large and dexterous and patient with small work. Catherine was on a blanket on the porch boards in the last of the warm afternoon sun, exploring the world at the age of 1.5, with an enthusiasm that made her perpetually muddy, and usually at serious risk of attempting to eat something she should not. And she looked up when Letitia came up the porch steps and said, "Mama," with the decisive satisfaction of a baby who has learned a new word and is very pleased to have occasion to use it. Letitia picked her up, held her against her chest, felt the small, warm weight of her daughter, and looked at Louis over Catherine's head. "She get on all right," he said. "She got on perfectly," Letitia said. He nodded. He went back to the tack work for a moment, and then he said without looking up, "She's going to be extraordinary." "She already is," Letitia said. The years moved on, as years do, with the particular combination of slow daily sameness and sudden profound change that constitutes a life lived fully in a place. The Broken Bow became a genuinely substantial operation, one of the steadier ranches in the county, known for the quality of its beef and the reliability of its contracts with the Caldwell stockyards, and, somewhat later, with buyers who came up from the new markets that were developing in the region, as Kansas continued to shift from open range to settled agriculture. Thomas at 10 was his father in miniature, deliberate and observant and deeply attached to the land and the animals on it, with enough of his mother's directness and opinionated intelligence that he could be counted on to tell you exactly what he thought about anything you cared to ask, and several things you hadn't asked. He had his father's ease with horses and the instinct for cattle management that seemed to simply be in him from some genetic inheritance, and Louis watched him grow into the ranch with a quality of satisfaction that Letitia understood was not about legacy or ownership, but about genuine pleasure in seeing a person come into themselves. Catherine at 3 was the universe's commentary on a couple who had believed they understood children. She was brilliant and determined and catastrophically energetic, and so endlessly verbal that even Clara, home for the summer at 19, spent several days simply watching her youngest sister in a state of respectful awe. Catherine had opinions about everything from the arrangement of her blankets to the names of the horses to the order in which things should be done in the morning, and she expressed all of these opinions with a volume and certainty entirely disproportionate to her size. "Where did she come from?" Clara said one evening, watching Catherine conduct a serious monologue to a patient Thomas about the correct way to stack pebbles. "Us," Letitia said. Clara looked at her mother. "I'm sorry," she said. Louis, who was listening from his chair, made the particular small sound that was his version of laughing aloud at something. Clara went back to Emporia at the end of the summer with a portfolio of new work and the beginning of something that looked very much like a professional direction, because the head of the art program had told her, with the directness of someone who has seen a great deal of student work and knows quality when they encounter it, that she had a future in this if she wanted to pursue it. She came home at Christmas that year with a confidence that was different from the 17-year-old determination she had left with, deeper and more settled, the confidence of someone who has tested themselves in a new place and found they hold together. Letitia stood in her kitchen on a January evening in 1893, with the cold pressing at the windows and the stove warm and bright beside her, and the smell of the supper she had just finished clearing from the table still in the air. And she thought about the morning she had climbed that broken ladder with the cedar shingles under her arm and the leather pouch of nails at her shoulder. She thought about the way the October sun had been on the roof, and the way the wind had moved across the prairie, and the way she had been so entirely determined to manage it alone, because she had learned to manage everything alone. And then a man had ridden up, quiet on a dark bay horse with a white star, and had looked at her broken ladder and her bundle of shingles, and had not said a single word before he climbed up after her. She heard his boots on the porch now, Louis coming in from the last check of the evening, and Catherine's voice from somewhere upstairs raised in an argument she was conducting with her blankets, and Thomas calling down from his room that he had done his reading, and the fire in the stove talking to itself in the orange voice fires have, and all of it was her life, all of it was real, all of it was the kind of solid, present, daily abundance that she had not known she was capable of again after Robert died, and that she was grateful for with a depth that had no bottom to it. The door opened and Louis came in, bringing the cold air with him and the smell of horses and dry grass, and he looked at her from the door the way he still did, directly and fully, that clear, steady regard that she had looked into for 11 years now without it ever becoming less. "You're standing in the kitchen looking at something I can't see," he said, which was his way of asking what she was thinking. "I was thinking about the ladder," she said. He came to the table and sat down, pulling off his coat. "Which ladder?" "The broken one," she said. "The one you found me on." He looked at her. Something warm and aware moved in his expression. "I think about that sometimes," he said. "I know," she said. "You looked furious," he said, "at the ladder, at the roof, at the general situation." "I was furious," she said, "and managing it." "Yes," he said, "you were." She sat down across from him at the kitchen table in the warm light of the lamp while the cold moved outside and the house held them in. "I'm glad you came by that morning," she said. "I've been glad every morning since," he said. They sat in the warm kitchen, in the house that had become theirs, on the land that carried their history, while upstairs their children inhabited the rooms of their growing, and in Emporia their eldest daughter was becoming who she was going to be. And on the Broken Bow the horses stood in the warm barn and the cattle were settled in the winter pasture, and the wide Kansas plain lay under the cold January sky that went on forever in every direction, immense and clear and full of stars. And it was a good life. It was a genuinely, entirely good life. Not a perfect life. Not a life without loss or difficulty or grief or the weight of things that cannot be fixed, but good the way real things are good, with depth and texture and the particular beauty of something that has been lived rather than merely imagined. Letitia Hawthorne Sheridan looked across the kitchen table at the man who had ridden up on a Tuesday morning and climbed her roof without saying a word, and she thought that of all the things she had managed and endured and survived, the best thing she had ever done was hand him that hammer. Spring came again, the way it always came, with the greening of the grass and the return of the meadowlarks and the particular wide-open quality of the Kansas sky that had been pressing down all winter and now lifted. And Clara came home for a long visit with a new portfolio and news about an exhibition in Emporia where 3 of her pieces had been shown. And Thomas spent the first warm days of April in the south pasture with the new calves. And Catherine walked beside her father on the morning rounds and asked questions about everything they passed, and Louis answered them all with complete seriousness. And the cottonwoods along the creek put out their leaves like pale green stars against the April sky. And somewhere south of the original claim, on the porch of the house she had made her own from an empty one, Letitia Hawthorne Sheridan sat in the afternoon sun and listened to the sound of her family filling the air around her, and was, wholly and without reservation, at home.